This is Bonjour Hi, the Jew Don't Belong edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey and special guest hosts Lex Rofeberg and Arno Rosenfeld. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, marketing the Jewish people in advance of a prominent ad on the Super Bowl from the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism and a host of other efforts, we ask, who is this marketing for, and is it actually going to do any good? All this and more right after we hear from our sponsor.
Don't take half measures when it comes to home security. Alarms and cameras work, but they'll only tell you that your worst nightmare just came true. Safety Screen by Metalex for windows and doors will keep your family safe and sound with real stopping power. They can't be cut, pried, or bashed in, so you can enjoy carefree ventilation in the spring and fall with peace of mind. And protect your fixed windows and doors with Rock Glass, an absolutely unbreakable clear covering. Call 416-638-2539 or visit metalexsecurity.com to book your free consultation. That's METALEX security.com. Remember, prevention is always better than the cure.
Lex Rofeberg, amongst many other things, is the host of Judaism Unbound and an educator with the Yeshiva, a digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. Lex, welcome to Bonjour Hi.
Thanks for having me.
And Arno Rosenfeld is a journalist at The Forward, where he focuses much of his efforts on reporting about anti-Semitism. Arno, welcome to Bonjour Hi.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
You, Arno, you actually have a Canadian connection.
I do, yeah. A couple Canadian connections. So I grew up on the West Coast in San Francisco, but I went to college at the University of British Columbia. So I was up in Canada for a few years for school, where I did some freelancing for the Jewish Independent in Vancouver, and also was a stringer for JTA. So I covered sort of Western Canadian news for a couple of years. And I remember I wrote a piece for the Times of Israel about a Canadian potash company that I think was trying to do some mining in the Dead Sea. So I had a little bit of time in Canadian Jewish journalism. And then my sister actually went to school, she's a few years younger than me, went to school at McGill and is now living in Victoria. So I've spent a good amount of time in Canada.
I think you have more Canadian Jewish cred than I do.
I can't say I've ever spent that much consecutive time in Canada. I will say I've been to Canada a bunch of times the past few years, and it's been very fun, and for a variety of mostly Jewish purposes. I was in Winnipeg for a Limud event. I was in Calgary for a youth group event. I was in Toronto for a Limud. I was in Montreal just with my wife because she had a conference there, and I decided to work from there for the week because Montreal is cool.
It really is.
Yeah, I've enjoyed all my time in Canada. So I'm trying to think if there's any other.
We're doing a good job
trips,
marketing
but
Canada, I think, on this podcast.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah,
I see
thank
what
you.
you did there. Marketing Canada, marketing Judaism.
In our pre-show meetings, we actually had discussions about like what marketing actually means, right? Is it different from branding, and who the audience is for any sort of marketing or any sort of branding or anything like that in advance of like the topic that we're going to cover. And I imagine we're going to touch on a lot of this in our discussion. But to frame this and to get the ball rolling, let's start with the Jewish organizations and their internal rebranding efforts. Recently, the Reform Movement did one of these. You covered it, Arno. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I actually worked at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism for a little over a year when I first got to DC, and I used to put the disclosure in all the stories, but now I've worked at the Forward much longer than I ever worked for the RAC. But I closely follow their stuff, and I worked in communications for them. And so when I started getting these emails that had a new logo, and I was like, did they change their logo? And I sent them a message, and they were like, oh yeah, we changed it. I mean, are you going to send out a press release? And they said, no, we aren't going to send anything out, but we're doing this little refresh. And so I was like, well, I want to write this up. I know lots of people are very passionate about a lot of Reform Jews feel very connected to the movement. So I thought people would be interested in it. They basically did their first big, they got new logos. So their first big rebrand in 15 to 20 years. It depends a little bit on how you count it. Their previous logo dated back to when they were the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. They changed their name to the Union for Reform Judaism, but they kept the sort of menorah style logo. And then the Religious Action Center had used going back as far as I could find, which was to their first website in the 90s, the High, the Hebrew letters for High, along with sort of a blue color scheme, and they got rid of the High. So in both cases, they sort of got rid of the menorah, they got rid of the High. Of course, you could read that as removing Jewish iconography. As someone who worked at the Religious Action Center and had no idea why we had the High as part of the logo, and I think everyone in the communications department was like, sort of a weird relic. It doesn't really make sense. I don't want to go too far in that direction, but they streamlined their logos into these kind of interlocking letters. It's a little bit of a 1970s vibe, which we've seen with some other Jewish organizations in recent years. And then they accompanied those with a set of these sort of abstract symbols that they're going to pair with. So now I've started to get fundraising emails where they're pairing some of these symbols with the new logos. And yeah, it was launched, I guess, at the beginning of this year as part of they had just celebrated their 150th anniversary. So it was part of a refresh related to that anniversary, I think.
Lex, when organizations do this, and not just organizations, movements, right? We look at the Reconstructionist movement, which has rebranded itself as Reconstructing Judaism. Is this a good thing for the Jews? Is this a desperate move to remain relevant? Is it needed? I'm the first one to say that a brand refresh is always important to stay visually relevant. But what's going on in the larger conversation when internal organizations need to rebrand like this?
Yeah. Well, the last piece is interesting, right? Like when organizations need to rebrand like this, I think sometimes they need to, and I think a lot of times they want to or choose to, and I don't have like super strong feelings about the good for the Jews question. I think that we've at my own organization, Judaism Unbound, we had one major rebrand at one point. Nothing to the scale of what I think was operating with Union for Reform Judaism, but I'm interested in unpacking what's underneath a lot of these, because when I look at shifts to, let's take the Reform movement's iconography, imagery, it's not just that they're doing a rebrand. I think there's a set of trends that their rebrand sort of demonstrates, and Arno's article does a fabulous job of showing this with other organizations too. There's, I think, for a number of decades, let's say the late 1900s. It's like a funny thing to talk about. The 80s and 90s. I think many legacy institutions of Jewish life were characterized by logos and imagery that seemed to be going for an aesthetic of like authentic and ancient. And there were menorahs, and the colors were not particularly bright. And I'm not saying this critically. Like they were dark blues, and they were sometimes browns. They were less like aggressive colors. I don't mean aggressive negatively. It's just like they didn't seem to be trying to catch your eye really effectively. They wanted you to feel like, oh, this is like a manifestation of a religion, of something that is time honored, and they wanted to send that message through their images. And then what we see now with a lot of these rebrands, URJ and others, is a shift towards much brighter colors. Also, this is a subtle thing, but I'm kind of obsessed with some of this stuff. A shift from serif fonts to sans serif fonts, like almost 100%. It's like wild how completely it is hard to find serif fonts in Jewish life anymore. But like there's
well, that's true across the board.
Things that are operating there, right? Yeah, but that's what I'm getting at. I want to ask sort of, are the questions that Jewish organizations asking, like, how do we best serve our people and get our name out to the world? Like, I think that's what they're trying to do. But I think what often happens is an effort that sort of replicates broader shifts in corporate marketing. And so like that might or might not be good. I don't know. It's not to say that that's inherently evil or inherently great.
You may not have heard about this piece, but recently the Toronto JCC did a rebrand, and they came under some fire because the Magen David was all but eliminated, except for like hinting at it within the logo. And one of the things that I notice is that for internal facing organizations, meaning organizations that are primarily Jewish facing, the need to put in the religious iconography is not always needed or present, because if you know URJ and you're going to get used to this logo of what it looks like, you don't necessarily need to be like hit over the head with a Magen David or a menorah or anything like that. And they're basically saying to within their organization, right? And I think what they have done, URJ, is actually pretty good. They're basically saying, look, we need to stay relevant visually at the very least. Otherwise, we are going to be seen as your Bubby's Reform Judaism, or the JCC in Toronto, the same sort of thing. You know, that's fine with me. It's when organizations are needing to, like, you know, I had a harder time, for example, with reconstructing Judaism, right? To sort of say, like, we don't believe in this word reconstructionist anymore. It's not as relevant to us, and we want to be able to, like, you know, say that we have new things to say about Judaism that our previous branding wasn't saying, our brand story. And I think that was that's, you know, different. I don't know if that.
I think it's just a funny word. Yeah. I think they went from one word that people didn't know. Yeah, well, both of them. I think they went from one word that they were hearing from their people, like, folks in our communities, they don't know what reconstructionist means. Like, and so their thought was, oh, reconstructing, that's a word people actually use. Like, constructing, reconstructing, like, that's like more straightforward. But when applied to Judaism, it's equally unclear to a lot of people what that means. I actually, like, if I lived in a perfect world where we could all have like an unlimited amount of time to explain branding to people, I kind of like reconstructing Judaism as like I don't know, I think of like hard hats and like we're out there and we're like doing the project of creating a new, I like that, but I do think that it's not very effective at conveying anything about what kind of Judaism
think, by the way,
that project
you
is
missed
doing.
The branding opportunity when you call the Onion Yeshiva is make it a project of deconstructing Judaism, and that could have been your brand.
That's interesting. I mean, we could talk about the choices we made with the Onion Yeshiva. I mean, we've gotten pretty good feedback on it because we blended English and Hebrew, which was very intentional. We took a word that not everybody knows, but many of our audience know in yeshiva. And so we send the message simultaneously that like we're a Jewish learning thing, but also like hashtag not like other Jewish learning things. And that seems to be working for us. But going back to the reconstructing thing, like I actually do like that sort of we look at their color choices and other elements of their change. They went to sort of I don't know, it feels kind of Hamish in Arno's article. It's like this little green, grassy, almost sort of lulav-looking imagery. And I think what we've seen in the past few decades is it used to be this sense that, like, to be a Jewish organization was to be blue and white, pretty much. There were occasional exceptions to this, but almost all legacy institutions used that color palette. And there were Jewish colors. And now we're seeing a lot of organizations, including the URJ, although they still went with predominant blue in their new version, saying implicitly, like, to be Jewish is not to hew to a certain color palette. You can manifest Judaism in all these different ways.
Can I ask a question about the colors specifically? Yeah. Does it relate to a shift away from Israel as a central identity? Is that,
I think it relates to a marketing choice. I don't think it relates to a choice in the actual content of what these organizations do. I wish, as somebody who wishes that Israel played a different role in these organizations' work in almost every way, I don't know that I see sort of content changes about shifting away from Israel. I do think that they are aware that if their goal is to reach people outside of their orbit, Jews and their loved ones, it is not useful to them to make branding choices that feel Israel-ish. And I think that's part of what comes up with the Star of David.
Well, another question I had about that is that there's also, so it's the idea of reaching Jews with different views about Israel, different levels of interest in Israel, but also there's the question of non-Jews who may or may not want to enter a building with a great big blue and white sort of Israeli flag motif logo.
For what it's worth, a lot of Jews don't want to.
I think so the Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, I think there were organizations like the conservative movement in the U.S. seemed to have basically like a dark red color scheme before this. So I also thought that it was almost, the Reconstructionist movement seemed to be using a purple color scheme, at least for their rabbinical college. So it wasn't universal. I mean, the Orthodox Union basically used to just have the hechsher was their logo, the black and white hechsher, and then they updated to a blue and white logo. But I think it's interesting, Phoebe, what you said about who they're marketing to, because to bring it back to what Lex was saying sort of at the start about trying to, the old names used to be these very established titles that, suggested a lot of authority. And now it seems like their Jewish organizations are playing on the same playing field as other organizations because they realize that, 50 years ago, you had a built-in audience. It's like you were a Reformed Jew. You didn't really care what the UAHC was called or what their logo was. Now, you might nominally be a Reformed Jew, but you're also, your Saturdays are kind of up for grabs. And so a bunch of people are making draws on that. And you don't want to necessarily come across as the staid, old, synagogue arm of the Reform movement. You want to be more dynamic. And I think we see this with names as well, because, if you look at the Religious Action Center, which is one of, 4 or 5 mainstream but very progressive Jewish organizations, and what's its official title? The Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which is not something you would ever name a Jewish social justice group today. The Religious Action, what does that mean of Reform Judaism? It's a very long title, but it was from an era when who were their peer organizations in the 50s and 60s when they first came about? It was the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. It was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. And now, the new organizations that they work with, Bend the Arc, Truah, NCJW, National Council of Jewish Women, is still one of those throwback organization names. But I think they realize that they're trying to compete with everything you're seeing on social media, everything you're seeing on your local events calendar. And so I think that relates to how they've moved away from some of that branding that was making an appeal to authority. Now they really need to convince you in a very crowded sort of landscape that they are dynamic and interesting and where you should be putting your energy and also obviously money.
Mm-hmm.
They also want really short URLs and not really long URLs and Twitter handles and Instagram handles. Like it's amazing how much that stuff matters to these choices.
Yeah,
but
the menorahs mattered before, and now it's the URLs and the handles that you get. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I just went to the Conference of Presidents of. I was thinking, where could I see the most logos at one time? And I went to the Conference of Presidents website. And they have a list of all their member organizations. And it's really interesting to see all of them alongside each other. The color scheme continues to be very dark blue centric on their page.
To be fair, by the way, and that's one thing, there's been articles about this, about how the color of the internet is blue. Blue is the color of the majority of logos on the internet, not dealing with anything Jewish, and that blue is a safe color that people are choosing. And we can get into the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about this, but if you think about the major the major tech companies, many of them have blue as their color.
And I was looking for better articles about how blue became associated with Hanukkah and with all these Jewish things, and I came up a little bit, not empty-handed, but not getting as much as I hoped I might.
Is it obvious, it's from the Israeli flag?
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the consensus, but it's also where did the Israeli flag come from? Okay, from the Talit, from the snail's blood, but
exactly, yeah.
But and maybe it's just that we don't have enough color photographs from before the establishment of the State of Israel. But I'm like, well, what were people? What color were Can you
imagine the branding meeting sitting in? I feel like there's a whole movie to be made about the branding meeting for the State of Israel in 1947, 48. All these hardcore Israelis sitting there fighting over the discussion.
Well, even the name of the country, right, was an open question.
That is an actual discussion that has happened, that we know about.
Yeah. But
I think to a degree we don't talk about the green and red of Christmas also plays an implicit role in Jews not using sort of pine colored green thing. There's a way in which we want to be deeply not that. In some of our
I think Phoebe was just realizing that the green and red means something else nowadays.
Yes, well, I was going to say that I'm sure I've brought this up on the podcast before, but that once I saw somebody in my neighborhood in Toronto putting up a flyer that had red and green, and I thought, I assume this is one of the many pro-Palestinian flyers going up in the neighborhood, but in fact it was for some sort of Christmas market, and that surprised me because it's not often what these are now. But
And there was that whole thing, I don't know if you followed, the watermelon, right, has become long been this symbol of sort of Palestinian liberation. And I think it was the Democratic Socialists of America held this event outside Hakeem Jeffries' office, the House Minority Leader in New York, who's African American, and they were like, oh, we're going to do like an art project, and they used a watermelon to illustrate it, and they thought it was very self-evidently Palestinian, and Jeffries' office said it's racist because of the association with negative stereotypes about African Americans and watermelons, and so it's all like you start getting a couple orders of degrees removed from the core thing, and everyone has their own interpretation. The quick thing I would just say, Lex, about the Conference of Presidents is talk about an organization that has not rebranded. I mean, you were just on their website, which is very difficult to use. Every time I have to write about them in an article, I'm like, oh, I can't call them the Conference of Presidents because nobody knows what that is. And also it doesn't say anything Jewish, but their full name, the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, is the most unwieldy.
I call it Cotton Joe in my head. It sounds like Cotton Eye Joe, that wonderful dance song.
Every time I hear about this organization, I think like this is the stuff the Jewish conspiracy theories are made of.
Avi, to ask a question, to maybe like broaden this out, is marketing of a religion unique to Jews among the sort of established religions? So I don't mean like newer religions.
Such a good way.
Certainly not.
I was
not
literally
lately.
about to transition to this point.
I'm sure like you can see like Jehovah's Witnesses. They have an office near me in Toronto. They clearly have like a logo.
Well, the Lutherans are interesting. I grew up in Wisconsin where there's lots of Lutherans. Every school in my sports conference in high school, except for my own, was Lutheran. Or there were like 2 non-Lutherans. I don't think the Lutherans are doing much. I do think that a lot of Christian groups that try to brand themselves as sort of just Christian, which usually means like evangelical, are doing a lot of this. We're recording this, Super Bowl-ish time. We've got the Super Bowl in our midst. And like last year, or maybe 2 years ago, I don't know when it was, there were these "He Gets Us" advertisements about Jesus, like Jesus gets, and I watched it, and I was sitting there with my friends, and I was mostly with people who were not Jewish, and we ended up talking about, like, for them, I mean, they're not like religious, but they were just like, that's kind of weird. We're like advertising for Jesus in a Super Bowl ad. I sat there and I'm like, "He gets us." That's actually kind of menacing. Like gets in the sense of like grabs or takes. Like that's not what they mean it as. But as somebody who is not part of the cultural group being like advertised, like not part of somebody who identifies as Christian, I was like, he gets it. It felt really like kind of menacing to me, even though that's not what they meant. But I've been seeing those ads. I watch a lot of sports on the sidelines of basketball courts. There's like Jesus ads very regularly now with this. I don't know the name of the project, but this "He Gets Us" thing. And I mean, we haven't talked about Jubilong yet, but like,
we want to.
Jubilong,
we will.
yeah.
We will.
Let's talk about
let's bracket that for a second. I want to get to the rest of the Super Bowl. I want to deal with the past Super Bowls where there have been ads like "He Gets Us," and there have been ads for Scientology. There have been ads for Latter-day Saints, for the Mormons, and last year and this year there have been ads from the Kraft Foundation's the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. Arno, you covered it last year, I believe, the ad from last year, and I know that there's an ad coming up this year. And from what I understand, they apparently filmed multiples because they didn't know which one they were going to use, and they switched at the last minute because the Canadian Jewish News leaked one of the stories and killed the surprise. So now they got ahead of it and did another surprise. Can you fill us in on some of those? And I want to ask that question of who is the Super Bowl ad for versus moving into other things. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came to the FCAS advertisements after the Super Bowl because I believe Robert Kraft ran a few of these ads that were sort of just text on a black background, very, very simplistic ads. And then last spring, I believe, was when the more highly produced advertisements started coming out. So the ones that had actors and directors and all of that, March of last year, is when they started releasing these really highly produced ads that had these moving stories and sort of these vignettes of anti-Semitism, and it was part of a $25 million campaign, which came on top of millions of dollars that Robert Kraft had already spent on FCAS, but it was sort of the big public unveiling of this project that had been around for 3 or 4 years prior to that, but it kind of hadn't been doing anything. It was actually in the back of my notebook, like, follow up with why Robert Kraft has not appeared to have spent any of the $25 million that he pledged to spend. And then they, I get this press release saying they're running these national advertisements. And, I think there was a consensus that the ads themselves seemed pretty good. The marketing folks that I spoke to in the Jewish community said that they were good ads, but they also said, it's not totally clear who these ads are for, and we also have very little testing of whether these things work. And I think that partly this is a manifestation of trends in Jewish philanthropy that we've seen, and this is also true with the Forward has also written about He Gets Us, which is the name of this Jesus campaign, which is also the project of primarily one very wealthy evangelical Christian philanthropist who wanted to do this. And so on some level, if you're a nonprofit that has to answer to a kind of board of directors that has to go out and get online grassroots donations, you really need to be giving them something compelling. If you're Robert Kraft and you decide you want to run really moving vignettes about anti-Semitism on national television, you don't have to have a clear audience in mind. You don't have to track metrics or whether it makes a difference. You can just do it. And so I think, that's one thing here is like the questions that we're often used to asking kind of don't apply when it's just a wealthy guy's, fun or cool or to him, I'm sure, important idea. So that's something that came through a lot is like a lot of these are open questions. Who are these ads for? I don't know. What do all of you think?
They're not for me. That's what I would say clearly. So I am a proud Showcase Subscribe membership holder, which is our local movie theater chain, where I get like free tickets every month. Or not free. I pay for them. They then feel free because I've paid for them before. I get I see a lot of movies, and so I go to the movie theater regularly. And for a very long period of time, maybe 6 months, whenever I went to the Showcase movie theater, which is in New England, I live in Providence, Rhode Island, so I'm right where Robert Kraft has focused some of his efforts. Every single movie I went to, I had the pleasure of seeing an ad that contained a swastika and no Jews on somebody's garage door, which was from Robert Kraft. It was like, the point was, this is bad. And then there was like this seemingly moving thing where like the neighbor sort of paints over it while the Jewish family is off at school or work or whatever. And I was like, okay, that's fine. But like, I actually would prefer to not see a swastika. Oh, wow. Not see. I would prefer to not engage with a swastika and no Jews every single time I see a movie for 6 months. It's actually not my favorite thing. So I think that they somehow presume that this is the path towards getting people to like act when they see a swastika. Somebody,
and how
if
many
we're going to
swastikas are on garages? I don't know. I mean, this
right?
is,
like that's
yeah,
not the most common.
Yeah.
Like if we actually wanted to focus on. It also gets to bigger things about like how they define anti-Semitism. I think in recent months, the focus of a lot of these projects and of like the Anti-Defamation League has been forms of anti-Zionist public protest, sometimes anti-Zionist public protest and public actions that can manifest as anti-Semitism. Sometimes, in my view, not. It depends. And so we get into like really hazy territory of what it means to fight anti-Semitism. And when somebody like Robert Kraft, who is not, I don't think, a scholar of anti-Semitism, is just sort of throwing money at this, what we get is like a garage door swastika graffiti story arc where somebody's neighbor paints over it. Like, okay.
This reminds me a lot of a campaign I've seen here in Toronto that's about addressing anti-Asian bigotry. And you see this all over the subway and things like this campaign, not anti-Asian bigotry, although maybe that as well, that says something like you listen to K-pop, but you don't call out, people saying mean things about Koreans, or like you are learning Mandarin, but you don't call out anti-Chinese bigotry or something. Like it's something like that's kind of the pattern of the ads. And there's a bunch of them. And I think that the reason I bring this up in reference to the Super Bowl ad, it seems that the aim of something like this is about bystanders, is about sort of like how to be an ally, is about like speak up when you see, you know what I mean? Like that, I think that's maybe the point of things like this.
Yeah, and that's the point that I think that is weird about this whole thing is that if you look at the Super Bowl ads in the past of religious ones, like you said, it was it's always some rich guy who wants you to love Jesus, or a movement that basically says,
is this religious? Is this anything
so that's
about
my
Judaism?
point. That's exactly my point, is that it's either been like, be a Christian, be a Scientologist, be a Mormon, whatever, it is. We actually believe that if you hear this message for 30 seconds, you might have some part of your heart open up. And this is not that. This is basically saying, you don't have to become Jewish. Just know that
but
don't
it's
hate
not
the
even
Jews.
at all about
and I don't think that's
Jewish,
a compelling message. Exactly. It's not.
Is there anything religious about that?
That's a good message. There's nothing religious about it. And I don't
much
think
more
that
like
I think it's religious. I think it's religious. I just think it's a different. I mean, this gets into what is religion questions. I mean, I think a lot of things
We've
are religious.
Spoken about this on the show
religious.
about how the new religion of Judaism is fighting anti-Semitism. Right, it's the biggest tent.
And for some people, for some people, it's not fighting anti-Semitism. It's Israel advocacy. But I think that there are forms of nationalism. There are forms of even. By the way, I give talks all the time about how sports fandom is a religious practice. Like I think that there are people whose calendars and deepest joys and sadnesses are around a sports team in the same way that other people's are around Judaism or Christianity. Like I do think that this points to us broadening our sense of what religion is, because I actually think it shows us something about Christianity and Judaism, which is that when when a random Christian philanthropist does an ad about Christianity, they talk about something that is the content of Christianity, which is to say Jesus. Now, do they do it super directly? Do they give you direct quotes of Jesus? Not really. If I remember it right, it's like a montage of just like sort of different events and things.
Somebody feeling sad and then
Jesus.
reading the Bible and feeling good.
Right.
And saying, you can feel good.
But that's
without.
Yeah, to me, that's more effective. Like Judaism, like I come away with nothing about what it is to be Jewish. I just know what it is to hate Jews. And so then we go and complain when we write books like People Love Dead Jews or whatever. Like we complain when the biggest image of Jews is hatred of Jews as opposed to anything that we actually believe or think. We get mad when people don't know what our holidays are. We could do ads about like what the heck Rosh Hashanah is. We could do ads.
Well, can I just interrupt on this as the resident secular Jew here? Not everybody who is impacted by anti-Semitism cares about Jewish holidays or is an observant Jew even a little bit. And I think that, people like which matters for a couple reasons. I mean, it is a bigger pool of people. So if you're trying to just get numbers, for better or worse, and obviously for worse in many ways, talking about anti-Semitism is a bigger tent. That is, more people are impacted by anti-Semitism. However, another thing is that does sometimes make people more Jewishly involved in one way or another because they think about an aspect of their identity they didn't before, whether it leads to religious observance or Zionism or something totally different, depends. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, is that it's not that these are just interchangeable things and, we should focus on the positive. Well, the positive is going to be so many different things, and it's not, and I think it's harder to figure out what's the positive that's unifying,
Yeah. No, to be clear, I think it would be a useful service if 1 month before Rosh Hashanah there were billboards in places that said Rosh Hashanah is this day. Maybe if you're doing a thing meant for everyone, don't schedule it on that day. Like, to me, that would be a much more useful advertisement that I actually think would work.
It would be defaced in 2 seconds, but yes.
Oh, I totally would. And then there'd be articles about the defacement that mentioned that Rosh Hashanah is in a month that would serve the goals. Things being defaced doesn't make them not work.
This brings us to the big pink elephant, pun intended, absolutely, in the room, which is Jubelong, which started as an organization doing exactly that, right? Basically, either promoting Judaism to Jews, right, and basically saying you don't have to be the best Jew in the world to be a good Jew and be a good Jew and it's okay, and telling the world about Judaism in a way that was non-threatening and fun, and has made this like massive left turn to like really, really bizarre like campaigns on their billboards. Oh, you said it, not me. It's fine. To like this bizarre campaign of like hardcore fighting anti-Semitism in the most draconian, strict, weird, dark way possible, while still using this bright pink that Archie Gottesman, who is the founder of Jubelong, loves so much. what, Arno, what do you make of this? And let's I just want to
Yeah, and I think you can actually, Jubelong draws a pretty straight line from some of the things that Lex was talking about, that Phoebe was talking about. They started as pitching Jewish religion. They were advertisements sort of for Jewish religion, which kind of annoyed a bunch of people because they were they were like a little proselytizing, which is something that Jews don't always love. And they also seemed to be really flip about certain elements of Jewish religion. And they viewed that as radically open. Like, they had billboards like, if you eat bacon, you can eat bacon on Shabbat. And people were like, sure, but also why are we running an ad, campaign saying this? And then they moved to both obsessing over anti-Semitism and an understanding of anti-Semitism that fully incorporated, running billboards that just said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. In addition to one saying we're only X decades from Auschwitz, so no, we're not making too big of a deal out of anti-Semitism. And it's been wild. A lot of people have described it as cringy, but I also want to zoom a little bit further out from the FCAS Robert Kraft ads, from the Jubelong ads. There was also Shine a Light, which is a campaign, I think primarily in the United States, a coalition of Jewish groups running PSAs over Hanukkah against anti-Semitism. There's this really fascinating trend in Jewish polling. So American Jewish concern over anti-Semitism. For many, many years, the vast majority of American Jews, the one thing that and I don't know if the same trends apply in Canada, but they might, what does it mean to be Jewish? What's important to your Jewish identity is remembering the Holocaust. So that's been true for a very long time. Obviously, that's tied into anti-Semitism. But since 2015, 2016, with the rise of Trump in the US, American Jews have expressed unprecedented levels of concern about anti-Semitism. However, when you ask them, have you personally experienced anti-Semitism? That number has been flat at around 25% for the last 5 years. So how do you account for this skyrocketing concern over anti-Semitism that people are apparently not actually experiencing? And I think there are a lot of answers to that, and they don't all have to do with marketing. Certainly you can see anti-Semitism out in the world and be alarmed by it, even though you aren't directly touched by it. But I think there's a question, to Lex's point, if every time American Jews go to the movie theater or turn on a football game, they see a Nazi defacing a Jewish family's home, what are they then supposed to, and it wasn't just that that's the image, it's then followed by a statistic that says something like 1 in 4 American Jews have experienced, anti-Semitic vandalism. It's some statistic that is technically true, but when you look at, and I went and I did this when I wrote about the ads, I said, okay, how many Jewish homes were defaced by anti-Semites? We know that there are swastikas on bus stops, which could mean a whole variety of things, none of them good, but that's different than like a Nazi knowing where you live and spraying a swastika on your door and telling you to basically get out of the neighborhood, right? One is much more menacing. And it was something like, the ADL counted like 3,000 instances of anti-Semitic vandalism, 12 of which were against homes and personal property.
Because the ADL is not interested in the ADL has the sense I get, they have a lot of different delineations within their organization of kinds of anti-Semitic things, of even within vandalism. Like I had a experience here in Providence in a short period of time. A grocery store near where I live was graffitied with Free Palestine. So it was graffitied with Free Palestine. That happened shortly after, like a couple weeks before, in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is 25 minutes from here, so close enough to be in our same local news container, had a whole slew of Jewish graves defaced with swastikas and death to Jews, that kind of thing. From my perspective, those are two wildly different things in terms of what they I'm not happy about either of them, to be clear. But the fact that there are Jewish graves being defaced, number one. So people went to a Jewish cemetery. They went to a space that is specifically delineated as Jewish to do harm. That was their goal. And then the content of what they put was actually about our deaths and invoking symbolisms of the most well-known people who have perpetuated our deaths. That is a different thing from somebody going to a local grocery store that is not affiliated with any particular anything. It's like a I don't know, a lot of vegetarians go there. They've got good vegan substitutes. And putting Free Palestine, which maybe some people like as a message, maybe some people don't like as a message, but it is not a direct threat in the way that a swastika is. And so what happens then is we put those in a box called vandalism. We call it anti-Semitic vandalism.
If I can amplify what you're saying even more, is that we've looked at this on the show in the past. B'nai B'rith doesn't make a distinction between the fact that we are the largest victims of hate crime per capita across every other minority in Canada, whatever it is. But then you look at it and you talk to experts and they're like, yeah, that's because the Jews report everything. And so many other minorities don't have the same relationship with the police and they don't report anything. I mean, not anything. I mean, I'm being right. And so our numbers are often inflated because we're willing to see the smallest version of a swastika somewhere that some kid, use their finger to like do on the snow of a car and say, oh, see anti-Semitism. And we're going to report it. We're going to
I think you might be creating a portrait of the hypersensitive Jew that goes above and beyond anything I personally am going to want to endorse. I mean, I agree that there are differences among groups.
We've spoken to experts on the show about this.
But Avi, I think I might reframe this a little bit and say that there are groups with historical reasons for not wanting to go to the police about stuff. And that's
exactly my point.
But I'm saying, but these are two kind of separate pieces. Like,
no, I like basically what I'm getting at is a lot of us on the Jewish left spend a lot of time publicly talking about how problematic it is that we conflate. So first, that we conflate different kinds of anti-Semitism into one generalized box. And there I'm talking about things that are actually anti-Semitic. Like we treat I don't actually know the ADL's categorizations in and out, but an attack on a synagogue, an actual bombing, is like one anti-Semitic incident in the pack of anti-Semitic incidents that we put in our studies or whatever. So is the swastika on the car window that you're talking about. So is now Zionism is racism on a billboard, on a sign or whatever that somebody graffiti. Like, those are not the same thing. And when all of our ways of fighting anti-Semitism are premised on telling the world how many of them there are, which is what they are. Like, that's what Robert Kraft does in the commercials. That's what the ADL does. Like, they want to show the world that there is a lot of anti-Semitism. They're not interested in distinguishing between there's a lot of anti-Semitism of this kind, but not a lot of this kind, because their goal is to make the world fearful of perpetuating anti-Semitism, which is a good goal. But when you do that, you both minimize what anti-Semitism is because you're counting all of it the same, and you actually you do a worse job of fighting the really terrible stuff because you create thousands of anti-Semitic incidents that are all in your pot equally, and you don't actually focus. A lot of us come from a place of it's weird that we have stopped talking about Pittsburgh that happened 5.5 years ago. It's weird. That was a mass that a dozen, 13, a bunch of people died at a Shabbat service because a guy went in and killed them. And we're out here talking about college campuses and whether signs are ripped down. Those are.
Is that not recency bias to some extent? But
I mean, sure, but in the grand scheme, 6 years is pretty recent.
Sure.
I think that these organizations should be strong enough and smart enough that they at least think about the past bunch of years. There have been attacks on synagogues even in recent times, but we're having big articles about how there's attacks on synagogues and also people posting stuff in internet forums.
So
that's different.
I think there's also there's a depoliticization of, obviously, in the actual lobbying that groups like the ADL and B'nai B'rith do, there is a lot of politics. But Robert Kraft, who is a political being who's donated a lot of money to politicians, these ads are just people who hate Jews, right? I think one had a teenager who was posting kill the Jews online, the garage door, which is totally divorced from anti-Semitism as it's used in a political context, either to, advance a right-wing agenda, to the extent that anti-Semitism makes its way into anti-Zionist rhetoric. It's not about that. It's just the sense that people just hate us because we're Jewish. And you're running this national ad campaign. And the irony is, Americans, and I don't know the numbers exactly for Canadians, I would hope they're similar, really like Jews. When you ask people which religious groups they have the best feelings about, Jews are always at the top of the list. So most Americans are going to see these ads and either be like, oh wow, this is terrible, or be like, well, yeah, of course, if my neighbor's house got defaced with a swastika, I would, go over and comfort them. And then Jews are seeing it and freaking out. And it's like, what is this serving? And I think when you combine that with the fact that you have these hyper elevated levels of Jewish fear, and these ads don't really have a message for Jews. What are Jews supposed to do about this? They're just supposed to sit at home worrying that one day someone's going to come.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. But just to sort of pivot back to like what's for Jews, that seems like another piece. And then I wanted to kind of maybe bring the conversation, since we did talk about Jew belong, a little bit back to this idea of like coolness. And this isn't just Jews trying to do this, although it may, because I always think of like the pastor who's got the guitar and is kind of cool, right? And there's something very cringe about any time a religion tries to seem cool. And yet it seems like all religions maybe, but maybe particularly Jews. I don't know. We can discuss.
I always used to say that when I was involved with NCSY, which is one of the major Orthodox youth groups, was that you always had the advisor or the senior educator, whatever, that's always trying to be cool with the kids and be that cool guy. And I was like, I know that guy, and he used to not be cool in high school, and this is his desperate way to try to be cool. And I think that that's true of a lot of religious figures. It's that we're not so cool, but let's pretend that we are, because yes. We want that validation.
So the reason I bring this up now is when I see the Jew Belong billboards, that's kind of the vibe I get, is this is something that's trying to be cool and it isn't hitting that mark. But then the question is, I guess what I wonder in a sort of even bigger picture way is is cool even a relevant thing? Are most people cool? Do most people even want cool, even young people? And it just seems like it's maybe going down and not the most fruitful path.
Yeah, I think that's changing. I think it's fascinating. We've talked about this organizationally because we advertise some of our things as being really nerdy. We actually use that language. Are you a Jewish nerd?
Is cool, let's be honest.
And that there's a way in which it's and there's been generational conversations on our own team where people who are Gen X often are why would you do that? There's a lot of people who don't think of themselves as nerds. Why? And we're actually that's a better way to go, maybe. And again, we don't use it always, but I think you're right to name the youth pastor meme. I mean, even on TikTok, there's all sorts of there's people who have played with this idea of I'm the cool youth pastor, and Jesus did this, all of this, backwards hat, try to talk to, and we could even talk about in Adam Sandler's Bat Mitzvah movie, the rabbi in that. But I actually think she's interesting because I think she kind of is meant to be taken by viewers as pulling it off. The kids actually really like her because she's sincere. I think it comes down to sincerity, and what you feel with Jew Belong is, I don't have a respectful way to say this. It's kitsch. It's nonsense. It's not. What's funny is early on they had some pretty good resources and they still exist. Our family's Passover Seder actually used some of their cute little tellings of the story or whatever. But what they do is they try to distill stuff into little sound bites, and what they do is they create these ads where they've been fat phobic, they've distilled Jewishness to the assumption of not having blonde hair. They've posted ads where the meme is that somebody is blonde and so they're probably not Jewish. They've done all sorts of disrespectful things along all sorts of different axes because they think that it's cool, but they just have they have a terrible sense of what people read in that way. And the biggest element, as far as I can tell, of who their audience is that receives it and likes it is coastal folks in their 50s and 60s, and usually women. That's who seems to most gravitate towards it. Yeah.
And I don't want to bang on the source of funding drum too much, but I think that's where a lot of this comes from, because you also had Zionists, which is sort of I kind of think of them in a similar sense as Jew Belong, and they're this progressive Zionist, but the idea is we're going to show up to the abortion rally with signs about how Zionists support abortion rights, and their iconography is all based around that hope poster of Barack Obama from 2008. It's all these silhouetted images of Jewish women or other women in that iconography, and you can see that there was a moment in time when they got a grant to set up, and that's what was cool and trending, and so that's what they base their iconography around. But because they don't necessarily answer to it, I don't want to pick on Zionists, but I think certainly this is true with Jew Belong and many other Jewish groups, because they aren't beholden to a grassroots that is paying dues to them or something like that, you can't keep up with trends. Like, the way that you're cool is, I think, by being of and part of the community that you want to serve. And maybe you're the coolest, like you're the vanguard of that community. But to Lex's point, folks in their 50s and 60s who are paying for these billboards that are supposed to speak to somehow people in their 20s and 30s, that's never going to work. And that's the model by which all of these programs are supported, or at least the vast majority. So I think that's a huge source of where the disconnect comes from.
To the sincerity piece, right? The thing where they lost the plot, I find, and that really was like, wait a second, who are you people? Was when I started seeing them throw other Jews under the bus, right? When I got an email that said, fellow Jews, what was it? Clearly, we did not tikkun olam our way into the hearts of those we thought were our allies. New plan: put on your own oxygen mask first. Right. And sort of saying, if you're a lefty Jew, screw you. Right. It's time to stop being a lefty Jew.
I mean, I agree that that's a bad ad. I agree that that's a bad message, but I don't interpret it that way at all. I see this more as I see it as it's attempting outreach to lefty Jews. It's not sort of...
Yeah, but basically saying that your entire race on that. Yeah, they're basically saying that your entire way of being Jewish is flawed and wrong because you are caring about other people. It's time to only care about the Jews. And the problem with that is that you're only being sincere about being anti-Semitic and just fighting anti-Semitism, and the damage that I think is being done by this entire going from craft, this whole discussion is that there's nothing Jewish about simply fighting anti-Semitism. And this is not about religion versus secular, because I do think that as much as my tendencies are promote Judaism the way that Lex was talking about it, talk about Jewish holidays, talk about the great stuff that we've done, we have the ability and the responsibility to be doing that about culture also, right? You don't have this there's just as much positive, great Jewish culture that we can be talking about that will be of interest to secular Jews that doesn't have to be just fight anti-Semitism. And I think that it's damaging, and I think that they're not stopping to think about how damaging it is to Judaism, right, when all you talk about Judaism is about how much anti-Semitism there is in the world.
So, Avi, I totally agree with you about this, but my question is how logistically to do this when culture is so
I don't know, but the answer isn't billboards.
The problem,
and the answer
I feel like the problem that comes up logistically is that every Jew opposes anti-Semitism, whereas anything you do that's culture, too high culture, too low culture, too Ashkenazi, too not Ashkenazi. You know what I mean? They're all, you know what I mean?
My answer is that we haven't been good enough ambassadors at the micro level. There's 15 million ways to be Jewish, right? And we haven't made that clear to the 15 million Jews that there is some avenue into positive Judaism for you at the micro level. Whether it's we just came off of this. I'm going to be rabbinic, and we have this piece at the beginning of last week's Torah portion when Jethro comes and visits Moses, and he basically tells him, stop being the answer for everybody. Stop being the adjudicator for every possible thing. And he's basically saying you need people who are in charge of thousands and people in charge of hundreds and people in charge of tens. Basically, we need to create the Jews, or not to create, we need to remind the Jews that care about these things that you can go out and you can find 10 other people that you know that don't think about Judaism and find a way to talk to them about Judaism in a way that works for them because it works for you, right? And that's secular and that's religious. Be an ambassador for, and everybody is empowered to do that, and we don't. What we have is these mega rabbis. And we have these mega Jewish organizations that basically say, this is what Judaism is. This is all you need. This is what I'm going to throw out at you. We don't have mega rabbis. That's actually a problem. But we can bracket that discussion. But anyways.
Maybe you're the mega rabbi.
I really like that we're sitting I'm a cultural Jew. I say that very regularly, and people are always confused because I'm a rabbi also. I want to be really clear. I identify as a cultural Jew. I generate my meaning and purpose and Judaism in the world from culture primarily, and I feel like religion and culture are treated as a duality when they're not actually. And so a lot of my religious impulses I actually group under culture. But like I teach entire classes where the entire purpose is to understand Jewish pop culture and Jewish food across all sorts of differences of what Jewish food is, and sports, and like I teach entire things about how we need to understand those things as deep parts of how we scope our human meaning. And so we need to understand that culture is of deep import. So Phoebe, I really appreciate what you're saying, that it's harder to like take Jewish culture, because it's more tied to certain time periods, and like we don't have like a calendar of holidays that are on this day in the year. We don't have like Parshas where every week of the year we watch a different episode of a Jewish TV show.
And I just want to be clear about that. I'm not saying that we should only focus on
Seinfeld.
I am absolutely, well, not just for Seinfeld. I'm calling for a syllabus of Jewish life that is not just the Torah
I just wanted
portions,
to spell out that I'm not saying that we should talk about
portions.
anti-Semitism instead of Seinfeld, although Seinfeld talks about anti-Semitism, Uncle Leo.
Seinfeld's really interesting on that.
Yes, it is. And we could totally go down that path too. But what I was going to say is, I'm not saying that that's what we should do. I'm saying that I think that I'm just talking about the logistical challenges.
That's what I mean. Like part of my solutions to a lot of this are that we have to think more critically and more expansively about how we define Judaism generally. And that's why I devote my life to like revisioning and reinventing both Jewish institutions and sort of the content of Judaism itself. So for me, that's like, until we do that, the marketing effort is like, marketing is what you do to a product that you've decided on. And so it's like the R&D effort is what I am more invested in. But going to, I think what Avi might have been getting at is, part of the issue we have is that what Jubelong and Robert Kraft and everybody else are trying to do is reach the most people. We live in a world that is very segmented and that uses very different kinds of media. And so it is no longer the case that getting an ad on CBS on a Thursday is like automatically going to be the thing that most achieves what you want to achieve. It may be that getting an ad on a YouTube channel that a specific set of people are engaged in is, that's going to be a smaller number, but you may actually target it more effectively. We have a huge issue with marketing to Jews, which is that it is actually against the rules, that you are not able on Facebook and other platforms to any longer advertise certain things to like, Jews who have liked this organization, or Jews who identify, like, you can't segment by Jewishness anymore. You used to be able to, because they're worried about that being used for anti-Semitic purposes. I don't know if that was the right move. Like, if we're asking the question of like, who are the ads for, and like, how might we give Jews themselves and not just, Christians and others who are going to work against anti-Semitism, how might we target things to them? We have to be able to target, like, we have to be able to do that. And as of now, the only ways to do that are to offline put up a billboard in an area of town that has a bunch of Jews or something like that. You can't do it digitally because these platforms and governmental regulations have made it not permissible. So that was a long rant, but I do think that part of the answer is having Jubelong and Robert Kraft try to create ads for just everyone, as opposed to more targeted ads, is a huge part of the problem.
Great. And I'll make 2 points. One is, Lex, you talked about having a more critical and expansive sense of Judaism and what it means today and what we're even trying to market. And, and Phoebe, you mentioned that anti-Semitism is something we can all agree on, but I think I would encourage, listeners to take a more expansive and critical view of anti-Semitism, of fighting anti-Semitism, of what that means, because a lot of the sort of memified versions of let's fight anti-Semitism that we're seeing in these ads mask the fact that there is really a raging sort of debate in the Jewish community among Jews over not just anti-Semitism related to Israel, but over questions of, does Jewish safety come through solidarity with other minority groups, or does it, are other minority groups a potential threat to Jews and we should sort of put up walls and, improve our security? Where's the balance between those two things? There are a bunch of things that we need to really think about. And when you just get the message that you should be afraid to be Jewish and just defer to whoever is, raising their hand on your behalf, I think that poses a risk. And then on, maybe a more optimistic note, another thing that we see come through in the polling really strongly. We don't know whether these billboards or television ads work, although there's a lot of reason to think that they do not. What we do know is that people who personally know someone who is Jewish are far more likely to take anti-Semitism seriously and are far less likely to hold anti-Semitic views. It's not a perfect salve for these things, but I think about, when we're putting $25 million toward an ad campaign, $7 million for a 30-second spot, how much of that money could go toward building, Jewish community, to getting Jews out into the community, to doing interfaith events, to doing the sort of things that we know, those face-to-face interactions, that having an audience of 10 people where you get to ask someone questions about what it means to be Jewish. And then when you see something on social media about Jews, you're like, oh, well, I know that guy, and he doesn't seem like he controls the banks. We know that some of these things work. We don't know about the TV ads. We don't know about the billboards. So that would be my sort of closing thought on all of this.
Well, let's leave it at that for today. As always, we would love to hear what you guys thought. Please do email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca with your comments. Coming right up, our Nachas Broigus of the Week.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
Okay, so our Nachas is officially now Nachas or Broigus. Lex, do you have a Nachas or a Broigus for us this week?
First off, I love this segment. More Nachas and Broigus. I'm gonna call it a shkoyach, which adds a layer of sanctity to it, and is also an homage to the podcast Treif that I was a loyal listener to for a long time.
And will you tell us what that means?
Yes, shkoyach is sort of a sacred way in a Jewish context of saying, like, you've done holy work.
I see.
My shkoyach / nachas, I'm going to give to the tail end of the book of Exodus that we're in right now. Talk about a section of the Torah that does not get much marketing. The early part is really sexy, and where we leave Egypt and we get a whole holiday about it in a few months. But we're entering into this portion that is all about, like, building the tabernacle. I'm a big fan of this part of the Torah and its love for aesthetics. And it actually sort of endorses the notion that it does matter what we choose visually and how we brand our work. I don't think we talk about branding the Mishkan, the tabernacle, very much, but that's kind of what's operating here. And so I'm going to give my nachas / shkoyach to Betzalel and Aholiav, the two folks that drive that effort in the Torah. Weird one, maybe.
All the way back there in our first year of being Jews, we were already into commercial real estate and development. This is like clearly a deep Jewish business. Arno, do you have a nachas? Do you have a shkoyach? Do you have a broigus?
Yeah. I should give some nachas to my colleague Mira, who I think I mentioned, Mira Fox, who's done sort of the Lord's work in documenting a lot of these various marketing efforts. The He Gets Us, Jew Belong. Also, I don't know if you've gotten this in Canada, but I guess the Israeli government has been running these sort of uncanny Visit Gaza ads that are like tourism ads for Gaza, but then, oh no, Hamas ruined it on Hulu here. And she's done a lot of the work of asking what is going on with whatever the latest strange marketing gambit involving Jews or religion is. So definitely recommend folks read her work, and lots of her analysis has informed, I think, my views on all of this.
Arno, I ran into Mira Fox at a bar in Providence like a week ago.
The Rhode Island connection.
This is faded. I love it. Shouts to Mira.
Phoebe, what do you got for us this week?
Well, I'm going to be on the vanguard. Okay, so I'm rewatching, or not even rewatching, I should say, really watching for the first time an old television show called The Golden Girls, a well-known show. It's on Disney Plus, and which we now have because of kids. But I'm like, well, I'm going to watch The Golden Girls at night after they go to bed. And I was sort of doing this like funny deep dive into it, whatever. But then I learned from one of our colleagues, Mark at the CJN, he sent me, I saw on the Wikipedia page that B. Arthur, one of the girls who plays Dorothy, had done ads for Shoppers Drug Mart, the Canadian version of like Rite Aid or something like that, or Walgreens, like a drugstore chain, while she was on the Golden Girls, but that they had to only be shown in Canada. Like she didn't want people to know. It would hurt her brand to show that she was advertising this, drugstore brand. And then Mark sent me a YouTube that we'll have to put on the show page that's just like all of these ads, and they are incredible. Okay. Like one of them, she's trying to seduce the pharmacist. They're really funny. And yeah, that's my sort of Jews marketing little nachas. Avi, you're up.
Total nachas this week. I happen to be finding myself today and over the weekend in California. I'm doing a wedding, and it should be a fun time. But I realized that the town that I'm in, which is Camarillo, California, is right next to Oxnard, which is where the Baron Herzog winery is. And I was like, if you're not drinking Manischewitz, the bottle on your Shabbat table is probably from the Baron Herzog winery. I was like, well, I have to go visit. They have a restaurant there. I had a remarkably great wine tasting and meal there. I have to say, in hindsight, I probably would have eaten at the bar because the bar food seemed just as interesting and a fraction of the price. And my meal with the wine pairings and everything was like eye-wateringly expensive. And so, but I highly, highly recommend it. It was an amazing time, an amazing evening. If you ever find yourself in California, in Southern California, go find the kosher wineries and eat at their places, specifically like Herzog, but there are others that I've heard of that are doing good work. So check that out. Great show, everybody, all across. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us. I learned so much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Super fun.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending February 10th, Shabbat Parashat Mishpatim. The show is produced and edited by Zach Hoffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.